In 1991, the skies above Iraq lit up with weapons the world had never truly witnessed in action. Many of those systems still define how wars are fought in 2025, and some of their lessons were badly misunderstood. From stealth aircraft that left Baghdad seemingly blind to guided bombs striking with precision, this conflict reshaped the battlefield. Yet the most decisive tools were often invisible: satellites, jammers, and calculated psychological pressure that eroded the will to fight. By the end, Desert Storm produced a template of modern war. To understand how, we must return to its opening shock. The war that changed everything. The Gulf War is often remembered as the first conflict that unfolded in real time on television screens. For audiences around the world, the night skies of Baghdad burning under streams of tracer fire provided images unlike anything seen in previous wars. Color broadcasts transmitted by satellite erased physical distance and made combat immediate, something not confined to newsreels or after-action reports. The pictures were vivid, but what they captured was only the visible layer of a much larger transformation. Behind the footage lay the rapid collapse of what had been considered one of the strongest militaries in the Middle East. Iraq's armed forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands and were equipped with thousands of tanks, artillery batteries, and armored vehicles. Its air force was vast, and its elite Republican Guard, armed with modern Soviet-built weapons, was the vanguard of the regime's power. After nearly a decade of war with Iran, these units were combat-tested and expected to resist fiercely. Yet within weeks of facing the coalition, the very structure of this force crumbled with surprising speed. The reason was rooted not only in firepower, but in the way the coalition combined mass strength with new forms of information control and precision. Decades of Cold War preparation ensured the United States and its allies could move immense amounts of men and materiel across oceans and sustain them in distant theaters. Within 6 months of the invasion of Kuwait, a coalition force of roughly 1 million troops had been built up in the Gulf, an extraordinary demonstration of logistics at scale. But it was the fusion of that Cold War depth with newly operational technologies that shifted the balance in ways few had anticipated. Air operations provided the clearest demonstration. Coalition aircraft executed over 100,000 sorties during the campaign, establishing dominance in the skies and systematically degrading Iraq's ability to resist. What struck observers was not just the volume, but the precision. Stealth aircraft evading radar, strike packages guided by real-time surveillance, and satellite navigation directing forces across featureless desert. These tools pulled apart Iraq's command structure before its main units were even engaged. Once the ground war began, the coalition rolled over positions that had already been stripped of cohesion and situational awareness. This was not the victory of hardware alone. Many of the platforms in use were by no means new. The average age of American aircraft in the fight was over a decade. What mattered was how they were used in concert, supported by highly trained crews and an unprecedented integration of information systems. Surveillance aircraft stitched together a comprehensive picture of the battlefield. Digital communications gave commanders updates in minutes rather than hours. Precision-guided munitions, though only a minority of the bombs dropped, delivered outsized effects by striking critical bridges, bunkers, and communications hubs with single shots. The result was a series of cascading breakdowns in coordination that Iraqi units could not counter. Here the war revealed its true character, the merging of traditional mass with emerging information-age precision. Armored formations, infantry, and artillery still dictated the final push, but they did so within an environment already shaped by systems that magnified their effectiveness. Iraqi defenses collapsed not because tanks disappeared from the battlefield, but because those tanks could no longer operate as a connected whole. Their supporting infrastructure, supply corridors, command links, and defensive networks was methodically dismantled through targeted strikes. Television coverage, while striking, could not fully convey this deep disintegration. It showed the flashes of bombing raids and advancing columns, but not the underlying erosion of capability that came before those images. On the surface, the spectacle was of modern firepower. Beneath it, the decisive shift was in how wars were directed, fused across domains in ways Iraq's older systems could never counter. This imbalance underscored the gulf that had opened between militaries that had embraced new technologies and those that had not. Iraq's arsenal was large but dated. Its defenses were designed for Cold War battles of mass and attrition. Against satellite-guided navigation, stealth incursions, and integrated communications, they proved brittle. Numbers alone could not compensate for being blind, cut off, and relentlessly targeted by precision strikes. The legacy of 1991 rests here. For the coalition, the war was more than a regional victory. It was a proof of concept. Stealth was no longer experimental. Precision guidance was not a niche, but a strategic multiplier. What had seemed gradual improvements in the 1980s abruptly demonstrated themselves as revolutionary when tested in unified combat conditions. Nations far beyond the Middle East took notice, recognizing that the balance of effectiveness had shifted from mass to information-enabled precision. 3 decades later, many of the operational practices first validated in Desert Storm remain core features of advanced militaries. Satellite navigation, which once guided mechanized brigades across desert terrain, underpins every modern deployment. Stealth design principles pioneered in the F-117 continue in the F-35 and B-21. Precision strikes, once a small fraction of overall munitions, now dominate Western arsenals in both capability and doctrine. Above all, the emphasis on dismantling an adversary's command and control at the outset became a central premise for modern warfighting strategies. It is for these reasons that the Gulf War is often described as a conflict that marked a dividing line in military history. It illustrated that mass armies and industrial firepower were no longer enough in isolation. The decisive edge lay in the ability to blind, isolate, and paralyze an opponent through control of information and precision application of force. The lessons drawn in 1991 have continued to shape strategy and procurement for decades, cementing Desert Storm's place as the war that changed everything. And yet, while the ground campaign was swift, the outcome had already been decided before tanks rolled across the desert. The true story begins not on the sand, but in the skies, where the coalition stripped away Iraq's most formidable defenses long before the ground fighting began. Air superiority, the true decider. Why did Iraq's Air Force, counted in the late 1980s as one of the largest in the world, appear to disappear almost overnight once the fighting began? On paper, it possessed hundreds of fighters, bombers, and ground attack jets, many drawn from Soviet designs and hardened by years of war against Iran. Its defenses included radar stations, missile batteries, and a dense belt of anti-aircraft artillery. Yet instead of contested skies and costly dogfights, coalition aircraft seized control in the war's opening hours. The explanation lies in how deliberately the coalition achieved air superiority, combining coordination, suppression of defenses, and stealth into a decisive strategy. The first major step targeted Iraq's ability to detect and respond. Before bombers even crossed into hostile airspace, command planners had mapped out a systematic scheme to cripple the nation's surveillance network. Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft, AWACS, flew beyond Iraqi reach, orchestrating hundreds of coalition fighters, electronic warfare planes, and strike groups under a single integrated picture. These airborne platforms provided near-instant detection of any Iraqi aircraft attempting to take off, guiding fast interceptors like the F-15 and F-16 directly to them. That constant oversight ensured Iraq never had the chance to regain control of its skies. Iraq's defenders quickly found themselves up against methods designed to neutralize them. Stealth was the most novel tool. The F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth combat aircraft, was sent against the densest defenses around Baghdad. Its geometry and radar-absorbing materials made tracking it nearly impossible. In the opening wave, F-117s struck power stations, communications hubs, and hardened bunkers essential to Iraq's integrated air defense system. Within hours, key sectors were blinded, unable to pass instructions to missile crews or alert fighter squadrons. Operators were left staring at blank radar scopes, only to hear explosions ripping through critical nodes moments later. These gaps widened under relentless electronic warfare. Coalition aircraft carried jamming and deception pods to overwhelm Iraqi defenses. Surface-to-air missile batteries and radar-guided guns struggled to function inside a haze of false returns, ghost targets, and noise. In many instances, operators fired into empty sky, their systems tricked or disrupted by coordinated electronic attacks. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night at phantom targets, while the actual strike aircraft released their munitions unchallenged. Iraqi air defenses were not obliterated at once, but rather rapidly degraded through a methodical suppression campaign that left their operators increasingly blind and disorganized. This did not go unnoticed by Iraqi pilots. Many recognized that climbing into coalition-controlled airspace meant certain detection by AWACS and almost immediate interception by superior fighters. A few attempted to fight, only to be shot down by radar-guided missiles before reaching their targets. The majority remained grounded, while large numbers of aircraft were eventually flown across the border into Iran, effectively removing them from the war. The decision to seek refuge underscored how fully the coalition had closed down the operational use of Iraqi air power. The intensity of the campaign reinforced this imbalance. Coalition forces flew roughly 116,000 combat sorties over 6 weeks, dispersing 88,500 tons of munitions onto command sites, supply corridors, and entrenched units. With skies uncontested, large strike packages could hit infrastructure deep inside Iraq with calculated precision, knowing escorts and electronic warfare aircraft would suppress what remained of the defenses. The steady tempo wore down Iraqi command and control, quietly ensuring that by the time tanks and armored brigades advanced, their opponents would be unable to coordinate a coherent response. Perhaps the most striking metric was the coalition's low aircraft loss rate, especially given the intensity of operations. Though some aircraft were brought down, most losses came from anti-aircraft artillery or short-range infrared-guided missiles, rather than Iraq's long-range surface-to-air systems or fighters. Against this backdrop of more than 100,000 sorties, the fact that only a handful of aircraft were destroyed highlighted the effectiveness of the strategy. Superiority had tilted so far in one direction that old methods of denial proved nearly useless. The ground campaign's rapid success cannot be separated from these weeks of air dominance. Bridges and supply depots were cut. Communication bunkers ceased to function. Tank divisions were frozen in place with no orders. Units that might have contested a mechanized advance sat in isolation, their capacity to maneuver shattered before the first armored spearheads crossed into occupied Kuwait. The massive army that Iraq deployed remained numerically imposing on paper, but much of its combat power had been neutralized by the absence of air cover and the collapse of its battlefield coordination. Looking back, the Gulf Air Campaign represented more than a localized success. It provided a model for how advanced militaries might fight wars into the future. The AWACS networks prefigured the kind of real-time surveillance and battle management systems now standard across NATO air forces. Stealth, proven effective for the first time under combat conditions, became a guiding principle for subsequent designs like the F-35 and the emerging B-21. Suppression of enemy air defenses through anti-radiation missiles, electronic attack, and deceptive tactics emerged as the essential first phase of modern air operations. Observers at the time could see the gap opening between a state struggling with legacy Soviet-era systems and a coalition wielding precision, integration, and information dominance. An Iraqi air force that had once shadowed Iran for nearly a decade without collapsing simply had no way to counter this fusion. The result was not merely coalition superiority, but air supremacy that persisted unchallenged until the conflicts closed. 3 decades on, Desert Storm's air operations continue to shape expectations in strategy and doctrine. Any major operation now assumes air control as the necessary condition for everything else. Without it, sustained offensive action or even defensive maneuvering becomes questionable. And the tools that made that possible in 1991, the seamless coordination of AWACS, the sharp edge of stealth platforms, and the rapid suppression of defenses, still frame how military planners conceive of war in 2025. That supremacy came at a cost to Iraq not only militarily, but psychologically. Once it became clear that coalition aircraft could strike anywhere, anytime, with almost no losses, the aura of protection normally associated with air defenses disappeared. Baghdad itself served as the most vivid testament to this reality. As each night residents braced for attacks that seemed to materialize from nowhere, without warning or visible approach. The stage was set for a new kind of campaign, one that revealed a different face of modern warfare under the cover of darkness. Stealth and the night bombing campaign. Baghdad's nights soon became the proving ground for a kind of aerial warfare the world had never seen. Long before any ground offensive began, the city's blackout-shrouded streets were lit by sudden, precise explosions. Defenses had been positioned to repel a massed aerial assault, but the attacks came instead from aircraft that could not be tracked and rarely even glimpsed. This was the debut of the F-117 Nighthawk in large-scale combat, an aircraft built from the ground up to be unseen and to strike with precision. At first sight, the Nighthawk looked unlike any fighter or bomber that had come before. Its blunt, angular surfaces seemed awkward, even ungainly, but they existed for a purpose. Those edges and facets scattered radar signals away from their source, while special materials reduced the amount of energy reflected back. To sensors guiding surface-to-air missiles across Iraq, the aircraft appeared as little more than a fleeting blip, too inconsistent to provide a usable target. Instead of relying on evasive maneuvers or overwhelming numbers, stealth sought to avoid detection entirely. In practice, this meant the world's most heavily defended capital could be penetrated without warning. When bombing raids over Baghdad began in January 1991, surface-to-air missile batteries and radar-guided guns had little success finding the attackers. Observers later described Iraqi crews firing vast stocks of ammunition into empty skies, desperately chasing faint or false contacts. The defenses were not rendered useless solely by the F-117. Jamming aircraft, anti-radar missiles, and AWACS coordination compounded the effect. But the Nighthawks helped blind crucial elements of Iraq's command and control system in those opening days, paving the way for follow-on raids that struck deeper and more frequently. This created a psychological dimension as significant as the physical destruction. In earlier wars, defenders could at least hear approaching bombers or see them massing. Here, explosions shattered facilities with no warning, eroding confidence that defenders could respond at all. Soldiers spoke of the disorienting quiet before sudden detonations, a silence that offered no time to brace or resist. Each night, command bunkers, power substations, and communications hubs disappeared in moments, leaving troops and civilians alike unsettled by the sense that nothing on the ground could stop what was coming. Inside Baghdad, uncertainty spread. Power grids flickered out, government ministries lost their communications links, and military installations found themselves isolated one after another. To those on the receiving end, the predictability of traditional bombing campaigns was gone. Iraqi radar operators never knew if a faint trace on their screen was real or a false ghost set up by electronic interference. The frustration of firing blindly only deepened the impression that their systems had already been defeated. Within weeks, many of the most critical command nodes were either destroyed or forced into improvised fallback modes. The Nighthawk's missions revealed more than just invisibility. They displayed the growing precision of Western strike capability. Individual aircraft often carried only 2 precision-guided bombs. These were not directed at sprawling barracks or industrial districts, but against hardened bunkers, leadership compounds, and transformer yards feeding the electrical grid. Operations that previously required dozens of conventional aircraft could now be carried out by a solitary pilot, using stealth to enter undetected, release a pair of guided munitions, and depart without loss. This economy of force compressed the scale of attacks while amplifying their strategic impact. The results did not go unnoticed abroad. Military planners in other nations had long measured the expected attrition of aircraft attacking a heavily defended city. Steep losses had been assumed inevitable. Instead, Baghdad, protected by some of the densest defenses in the region, was struck with unprecedented success and negligible losses by the attackers. Coalition aircraft as a whole flew over 116,000 combat sorties during the campaign and suffered only modest losses in return, a low rate that underscored the practical payoff of pairing stealth with coordinated suppression of air defenses. For observers outside Iraq, this was as alarming as the strikes themselves. A supposedly secure city could be dismantled from the air with minimal penalty to the attacker. The combined weight of conventional raids and stealth missions deepened the pressure on Iraq's leadership. Even though the F-117 represented only a fraction of total sorties, its strikes often provided the shock effects that undercut enemy morale. Iraqi generals never knew when or where the next hit would fall. A few facilities were destroyed in a single blow that bypassed defenses entirely. Each successful strike not only eliminated a target, but also made clear the defenses had no answer. That aura of invulnerability, maintained night after night, broke the cohesion of decision-making at the top. The Nighthawk was hardly flawless. Its stealth came with limitations in maneuverability, requiring computers to keep it stable in flight. Payload and range were modest compared to larger bombers. Even so, in its first true test, the aircraft exceeded expectations. By showing that penetrating strikes could reach the most protected sectors of a modern battlefield, the F-117 validated years of experimental design and secretive development. What had been viewed as a niche project in the 1980s instantly became a pivotal capability around which newer doctrines were built. From the broader historical perspective, the F-117's campaign over Iraq marked the point where stealth shifted from theory into core planning. In the years since, newer aircraft like the F-22 and F-35 have refined the concept with advanced computing and aerodynamics, achieving both stealth and agility. Programs like the B-21 bomber, now preparing for service, embody the same principle on a larger scale. Deny detection, infiltrate defended airspace, and strike with precision. While modern designs look more fluid and versatile than the jagged Nighthawks of 1991, the underlying logic can be traced directly back to those nightly missions over Baghdad. The Gulf War's night bombing campaign also provoked deep questions that linger to this day. Can conventional air defenses ever provide reliable protection against aircraft that avoid rather than confront detection? If so much ammunition was wasted against invisible or illusory targets in 1991, what would happen in conflicts where stealth platforms are deployed in even greater numbers? Iraq's experience showed that size and density of defenses do not guarantee safety. For many militaries, the lesson was unmistakable. Without the means to counter stealth, the strongest defensive networks could be unmade in weeks. Those nights redefined the image of air warfare. Where once the emphasis had been on overwhelming mass and visible destruction, Desert Storm presented a war of selective strikes, arriving suddenly and vanishing before a defense could react. For Iraq, this meant constant strain and mounting disruption. For the coalition, it meant that operations against high-value targets could proceed with confidence that losses would remain low. The disparities in technology and tactical approach made the difference, but the symbol that endured was the unseen aircraft delivering devastating precision under the cover of darkness. By 2025, the echoes of those strikes still shape both the aircraft flying today and the doctrines guiding their use. Stealth remains the threshold capability for surviving inside modern defensive networks, while precision weapons have become the expectation, not the exception. These principles are taken for granted now, but their dramatic debut took place in the deserts and skies of Iraq more than 3 decades ago. Yet the strikes themselves were only one part of the story. Just as critical as the platforms delivering them were the weapons they carried. The campaign's legacy cannot be understood only in terms of aircraft that avoided detection. It must also be measured in the accuracy of the bombs they dropped and the new way conflicts would be fought from then on. The rise of the smart bomb. The most striking shift in Desert Storm was not the aircraft themselves, but the weapons they carried. This was the conflict where the smart bomb first proved it could shape an entire campaign. While coalition aircraft still released the majority of their loads in the form of unguided munitions, it was the precision-guided strikes, the ones most vividly captured on television, that came to symbolize the war. They were a small minority in numerical terms, yet their impact far outweighed their share of the total tonnage dropped. Understanding that difference requires looking at how conventional bombs worked. Unguided weapons depended entirely on the pilot's release point, dictated by altitude, angle, and favorable weather. Even skilled crews could face erratic results. Wind drift, cloud cover, or poor visibility meant that what seemed a well-aimed release might land far from the intended target. Destroying hardened shelters or bridges often meant returning repeatedly to the same site, dropping dozens of bombs until the objective was finally neutralized. Precision-guided munitions changed this calculation completely. Using laser seekers or satellite guidance, they corrected their own path in flight, steering themselves onto the designated aim point with remarkable accuracy. Some of these systems had first been tested in Vietnam, but the Gulf War marked their large-scale debut. Laser-guided bombs in the Paveway family became central tools for striking bridges across the Euphrates or reinforced shelters concealing Iraqi aircraft. Aircraft often operated in pairs, one illuminating the target with a laser beam, the other guiding the bomb onto the reflection. For the first time, hardened sites and narrow structural points could be destroyed in a single pass. Television audiences worldwide watched carefully selected clips of bombs drilling through ventilation shafts or striking command bunkers with uncanny accuracy, further fueling the perception that nearly every strike looked this way. In reality, those clips highlighted a narrow portion of missions, but they captured the essence of what smart weapons made possible. The war also saw the first combat use of satellite-guided munitions. GPS technology was still in its early phase, yet was already accurate enough to steer bombs toward pre-programmed coordinates regardless of cloud cover or darkness. Where a laser designator might struggle under poor visibility, GPS guidance carried weapons onto buried bunkers or camouflaged missile sites. The GBU-28, a massive, bunker-busting bomb built in only a few weeks during the campaign, highlighted how quickly precision capabilities could adapt to emerging needs. Targets that had once seemed invulnerable, deep underground command posts or concealed air defense headquarters, were suddenly opened up to direct attack. Real transformation lay not in any single spectacular strike, but in how these weapons changed the tempo of operations. Before smart bombs, knocking out a vital bridge supplying frontline divisions could take days of repeat sorties. Every run risked aircraft losses as defenders became more alert. With guided munitions, 1 or 2 hits could achieve the same effect in minutes. A supply corridor depended on just a few crossings. Once those fell, entire divisions lost their logistical lifelines. Command bunkers that had been considered invulnerable to conventional bombardment could now be silenced with a single strike. In Iraq's case, concentrated blows on infrastructure compressed the timeline of collapse. Units were isolated sooner, reserves failed to mobilize, and leadership struggled to keep command networks functioning. The psychological effect was equally powerful. Conventional raids carried an element of chance. Troops could cling to the possibility that most bombs would miss, leaving key positions intact. Precision strikes erased that hope. To Iraqi soldiers, the destruction of a specific building or bridge in one clean hit suggested that nothing was beyond reach. The frequent display of footage showing bombs striking directly on cue amplified this perception, portraying coalition air power as both unstoppable and surgically accurate. For frontline forces already enduring weeks of air domination, the idea that no target was safe eroded morale further. Despite their outsized reputation, precision-guided weapons were never the whole story. They represented only a fraction of the munitions used, plugged into a much broader strategy of overwhelming firepower. Dumb bombs still leveled airfields, disrupted supply areas, and saturated armored formations, while precision rounds were reserved for high-value choke points or command nodes. The rapid collapse of defenses was not the work of smart bombs alone, but of a layered campaign. Stealth aircraft opening corridors, electronic jamming disabling radars, unguided bombs softening positions, and guided strikes knocking out the key links of infrastructure. What Desert Storm proved was not that precision replaced volume, but that when layered alongside it, a small number of smart weapons could shift the effect of the entire campaign. The efficiency of this approach left a deep impression on military planners worldwide. After 1991, defense ministries recognized that even if a single guided bomb was far more expensive than a conventional one, the overall cost-benefit balance favored precision. Fewer missions were required per target, fewer aircraft were lost, and the ability to strike without flattening entire neighborhoods carried political value as well. This was not just technological innovation, but a doctrinal pivot. Strategists began to conceive of wars fought through selective, deliberate strikes rather than sheer saturation. In the decades that followed, investment poured into this principle. Paveway bombs were refined into newer versions with higher accuracy. GPS-guided munitions expanded across multiple classes of weapons, from 500-pound bombs to ship-launched cruise missiles. The expectation of precision became institutionalized. Missions were designed from the outset to rely on guaranteed accuracy. Where in 1991, precision accounted for only a small minority of bombs dropped, by the early 21st century, this had grown to become the normal practice. By 2025, air campaigns in advanced militaries overwhelmingly feature precision guidance as the standard, not the exception. This legacy can be traced directly back to the lessons of Desert Storm. The performances of guided munitions demonstrated that wars need not hinge solely on attrition or vast numbers of weapons. Instead, measured precision could dismantle critical nodes faster and with fewer risks, shortening campaigns and reducing broad destruction. That lesson has carried forward into every conflict since, reshaping procurement, doctrine, and training across air forces worldwide. But even as smart bombs revolutionized the way targets were struck, their success depended on another invisible system. Precision only matters if the coordinates of a target are identified and verified in time. It is one thing to steer a bomb onto a bridge. It is another to know where an opponent's mobile command post is moving at any given hour. The Gulf War revealed that the true power of precision came not only from the weapons themselves, but from the broader network of information that told them where to go. And it was that network which began quietly expanding during Desert Storm, changing the nature of command and control on the battlefield in ways no less dramatic than the bombs themselves. Satellites and real-time warfare. How did commanders during Desert Storm seem to direct vast maneuvers with an almost instantaneous awareness of the battlefield? The answer lay not only in superior firepower or troop numbers, but in the arrival of a new domain of warfare: satellites and real-time communication. Desert Storm is often called the first space war, because for the first time, navigation, targeting, and command were tied directly to space-based systems that had only just reached operational use. The geography of the Gulf presented its own challenges. The flat, featureless expanses of Iraq and Kuwait offered few landmarks. In such conditions, traditional navigation with maps, compasses, or visual references often resulted in errors, delays, or units drifting off course. In earlier wars fought in deserts, those errors frequently led to confusion, missed objectives, or even fratricide when forces unknowingly crossed paths. In 1991, the Global Positioning System made its first large-scale combat debut, and it transformed how armored brigades, helicopters, and supply convoys oriented themselves across open terrain. GPS technology was still in its early stages, but even the limited receivers distributed to coalition units offered a level of precision that far exceeded any previous method. Instead of relying on dead reckoning or stars on a horizon, tank commanders could check their coordinates against satellite signals and confirm that entire columns were on course. Convoys crossing at night or in dust storms no longer feared losing their bearings. The result was faster, surer movements across terrain that Iraq's defenders had assumed would slow any attacker to a crawl. Navigation improvements quickly translated into greater safety. Coalition units advanced in close proximity, converging on objectives from multiple directions. Without reliable positioning, the danger of friendly fire would have risen dramatically. By anchoring movements to satellite data, commanders reduced these risks. Fire missions, airstrikes, and artillery barrages could be aligned more confidently with frontline units. Short reports from the field confirmed troop positions, and headquarters could coordinate supporting fires without the uncertainty that had haunted previous desert campaigns. This reduction in confusion saved lives and lent commanders a confidence that accelerated the pace of the advance. Beyond navigation, satellites enabled an unprecedented level of communication. Instead of relaying orders through chains of radio relays or field messengers, systems that could be disrupted, delayed, or intercepted, coalition leaders used satellite communications to connect frontline brigades directly to senior command centers. Updates on locations, engagements, and enemy dispositions traveled in minutes rather than hours. For the first time in a major conflict, commanders were able to act on a near real-time picture of the battlefield, rather than waiting on outdated reports. When the ground offensive began in February 1991, this visibility paid immediate dividends. Entire divisions maneuvered across the desert with a speed and coordination that Iraqi forces could not match. US VII Corps, for instance, executed a vast left hook across open territory, swinging wide to envelop Iraqi positions. Such a movement would have been far riskier in earlier wars, where units might scatter or lose contact in featureless terrain. With GPS to keep formations aligned and satellite relays ensuring constant communication, the maneuver bypassed defenses and encircled enemy divisions before many Iraqi commanders understood what was happening. Yet the technology was hardly universal. Not every platform had GPS integrated. Some aircraft, including certain attack helicopters, lacked receivers suitable for long-range movement across the desert. In a notable case, Pave-Low helicopters, equipped with GPS, guided Apache attack helicopters on initial raids against Iraqi radar sites, ensuring they reached their targets undetected in darkness. Such improvisations showed both how new the technology was and how quickly it was becoming indispensable. Despite its infancy, GPS gained a foothold in operations at every level, shifting from helpful innovation to operational necessity in less than 6 weeks of combat. The reliance on space-based systems extended beyond navigation. Satellites also carried the feeds that allowed laser-guided bombs to home in on reflections, relayed reconnaissance gathered by high-altitude aircraft, and kept regional command posts in constant communication with Washington, Riyadh, and beyond. For coalition planners, the war became a demonstration of what space could provide, not just intelligence snapshots, but a continuous framework linking operations together. In contrast, Iraq's command structure relied largely on wired connections and conventional radio. These were subject to bombing, electronic interference, and delays that often left frontline units waiting for instructions while coalition formations were already repositioning. This difference in connectivity underscored the meaning of real-time warfare. In previous conflicts, even the most well-prepared commanders had to work within delays of hours, sometimes days, to piece together a clear battlefield picture. In Desert Storm, the coalition moved forward with a clarity that appeared almost predictive. Orders could be adjusted mid-operation. Attacks could be retimed or rerouted with confidence that all units would remain in sync. Iraq's formations, left without links or dependent on disrupted communication chains, frequently collapsed in confusion, unable to react before being encircled or bypassed. The Gulf War highlighted that information itself was a decisive weapon. Knowing where one's own forces were, where the enemy was concentrated, and how to align firepower across those spaces provided an advantage as decisive as tank numbers or air fleet size. This was why analysts began to call it the first modern space war. Satellites no longer played a supporting role in collection, but instead underpinned tactics, strategy, and execution alike. Looking at the conflict from today's vantage point, those first uses of GPS foreshadowed the centrality of satellites in 21st century operations. Since then, the functions pioneered in 1991 have expanded. Drones now stream video directly to commanders on the ground, artificial intelligence sorts data into actionable alerts, and satellites supply constant positioning not only for armies, but for every smartphone in civilian life. The framework first glimpsed over Iraq has matured into an essential operating environment. But the same reliance that granted such freedom of action in Desert Storm carried long-term consequences. If satellites are the backbone of navigation, targeting, and communication, they also become high-value targets. Adversaries studying the Gulf War came away with this lesson. To reduce an opponent's tempo and clarity in combat, one need not always attack troops directly. Attacking space assets could cripple the flow of information on which modern warfare is built. This recognition has made outer space not just an enabler, but a military domain in its own right, shaping doctrine for decades after Desert Storm. Ultimately, the Gulf War demonstrated that victory could be driven not simply by weapons that destroy, but by systems that inform. It revealed that wars could be decided by information advantage as much as by numerical mass. Coalition forces succeeded in collapsing Iraq's defenses, not only because they bombed harder or fielded more tanks, but because they maneuvered with knowledge and precision that Iraq's commanders could not hope to match. Space, once the distant frontier, became a decisive theater of war. As the lessons of Desert Storm spread, militaries recognized that controlling information was inseparable from controlling fires and maneuver. Satellites and GPS had opened the door, but beyond the signals from space, another frontier was emerging, one where the contest was waged through invisible disruptions of communication and data itself, foreshadowing a new era of warfare yet to come. Electronic and cyber beginnings. The most obvious displays of Desert Storm were the burning oil fields and columns of tanks crossing the desert. Less visible, but no less decisive, was the struggle playing out in the electromagnetic spectrum. This conflict revealed the beginnings of a new style of warfare, one that targeted not just machines and fortifications, but the signals that connected them. Analysts now describe it as an early demonstration of information and electronic warfare, the forerunner of what would become modern cyber operations. Iraq had invested heavily in a layered command and defense system. Years of fighting against Iran had left its military adept at using radar-guided missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and centralized command posts to coordinate vast formations of troops. The Iraqis believed their integrated air defense, spread across hundreds of miles, could blunt even a determined Western assault. On the surface, it appeared formidable, but the coalition had new methods for dismantling those networks, methods that did not rely on firepower alone. One of the most decisive elements was the use of suppression missions against Iraq's radar network. Specialized F-4G Wild Weasel aircraft led this effort. These fighters carried sophisticated sensors to detect hostile radar emissions and were armed with anti-radiation missiles, such as the Shrike and the newer AGM-88 HARM. The tactic relied on a simple but lethal sequence. When Iraqi crews activated their radar to acquire targets, the emission itself gave them away. The Wild Weasels locked onto that signal and launched missiles designed to ride it back to its source. The result was a deadly cat-and-mouse game where radar operators had to choose between leaving their systems off rendering them blind, or switching them on and inviting near-immediate destruction. Though inherently risky, as the wild weasel crews had to expose themselves in the process, these missions rapidly whittled away Iraq's defensive network. The impact of suppression was amplified by jamming aircraft and pods carried on strike packages. Coalition systems poured electronic noise into the frequencies Iraq relied upon to communicate and track their attackers. Surface-to-air missile crews often reported radar screens filled with static, false returns, or ghost aircraft that did not exist. Radios between commanders and units were scrambled or blocked outright. Even when radars were not destroyed, they operated inside an environment so distorted that distinguishing reality from deception became nearly impossible. The overall picture was not of an instantly blinded network, but of one systematically degraded day after day until confidence and reliability collapsed. This deliberate erosion of command and control left Iraqi commanders increasingly isolated. Units at the front waiting for instructions often received none. Attempts to reroute messages through secondary lines were disrupted by jamming, while precision strikes took out hardened bunkers meant to serve as redundancies. The result was fragmentation. Iraq still possessed large numbers of troops and equipment on paper, but these forces fought as disconnected pockets rather than as a coherent whole. An army that should have been able to offer persistent resistance instead saw its structure dissolve into scattered and uncoordinated elements. Electronic manipulation also revealed itself in more subtle forms. Coalition forces injected their own broadcasts into Iraqi airwaves, competing with official regime channels. Where soldiers expected to hear orders or reassurances from their leaders, they sometimes heard coalition messages instead. Confusion grew as information sources blurred. For fighters at the front, the inability to trust what they heard from their own command chain deepened uncertainty about whether Baghdad could still direct the war. Though these techniques fell short of today's cyber intrusions, they carried the same underlying principle: control the flow of data to undercut the cohesion of the enemy. The cumulative results were unmistakable. By the second week of the campaign, many analysts were surprised at how rapidly Iraq's integrated defenses collapsed. Before the war, projections suggested heavy losses for coalition aircraft against such a dense network. Instead, with suppression missions ongoing and jamming constantly in play, coalition losses remained remarkably low. Iraqi radar operators often shut their systems down entirely, preferring invisibility to what had become near certain destruction. Missile batteries launched sporadically and mostly in vain, firing at illusions rather than actual aircraft. Fighters stayed grounded or fled across the border rather than rise into an environment they no longer understood. Command centers, too, became increasingly vulnerable. Guided munitions delivered by both stealth and conventional aircraft punched through hardened bunkers where senior officers attempted to restore coordination. With communication nodes reduced to silence and no trusted backup systems, whole sectors of Iraq's theater shrank into disconnection. Brigades ordered to counterattack never received direction, reserves remained immobile, and units already in contact broke apart without guidance. Iraq's military power had not been annihilated all at once. It had been dismantled piece by piece until the whole was far less than the sum of its parts. Other nations noticed. As much as foreign observers marveled at footage of precision strikes, they also studied the quieter war over signals and networks. The lesson was stark. To blind and isolate an adversary electronically could be as decisive as cutting down divisions in head-to-head combat. Radios, radars, and communications lines were not peripheral assets, but prime objectives. Those who could dominate the electromagnetic environment could dictate both the timing and tempo of a campaign. Seen in hindsight, this was the true beginning of the shift toward information warfare. The conflict in 1991 did not yet feature cyber intrusions into data centers or sophisticated hacks into computer systems, but the principles were already visible. To silence, deceive, and fracture an enemy's network was to take apart his fighting power before the decisive clash ever came. In later decades, The same principles expanded into the digital realm. Attacks against servers, GPS spoofing, and manipulation of online communication. But those later doctrines traced their ancestry to the suppression of Iraqi radars, the drowning of radios in static, and the clipped voices of soldiers cut off from their command. By 2025, militaries widely treat the electromagnetic and cyberspaces as domains of war equal to land, sea, and air. Aircraft routinely carry pods to jam and deceive. Drones probe networks alongside reconnaissance flights. Cyber units prepare intrusions intended to paralyze enemy decision-making before the first shot is fired. These practices would look sophisticated compared to Desert Storm, but the lineage is clear. What began in Iraq was the prototype for the information battles of the 21st century. The Gulf War also revealed the psychological weight of this invisible confrontation. For those inside Iraq, it was not just about machines failing, but the realization that their connections to command were unreliable. When signals could be jammed, orders silenced, or broadcasts hijacked, the sense of belonging to a larger coordinated force began to erode. Soldiers and units alike came to see themselves as isolated, vulnerable, and directionless. And it was in that environment, one where technology fractured not just command, but confidence, that the stage was prepared for what came next. Psychological warfare and deception. Why did so many Iraqi soldiers abandon their weapons without a fight? The explanation lay not only in bombs and tanks, but in a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare and deception. Coalition leaders aimed to convince Iraqi troops that their situation was hopeless, that resistance meant certain death, and that survival could only be secured through surrender. This strategy was waged just as actively as the air campaign, unfolding through leaflets, broadcasts, and deliberate misdirection that broke Iraqi confidence before ground combat began. One of the most visible elements was the torrent of leaflets scattered across Iraqi positions in the weeks before the assault. Coalition aircraft released millions of slips of paper from high altitude, letting them drift down slowly across trenches and encampments. Printed in Arabic, the messages served a dual purpose. They warned of the overwhelming power coalition forces could bring to bear, and they explained in exact steps how Iraqi soldiers should surrender. Conscripts read instructions on approaching coalition lines with hands raised, how to lay down weapons, and how to avoid being mistaken for combatants once they crossed over. For troops who had spent days under bombardment, these were not dismissed as propaganda, but treated as genuine guides to surviving the war. Reports later confirmed that surrendering soldiers often had these papers folded into their uniforms, kept as lifelines until the moment they chose to yield. Radio was another key medium. Coalition transmitters operated on frequencies Iraqi soldiers could tune into easily, distinct from official state broadcasts that promised glorious resistance. Instead, the coalition channels carried repeated messages stating that Iraqi commanders had abandoned their men, that their defenses were pinpointed, and that continued defiance would only guarantee their destruction. These broadcasts recycled the same phrases and tone, a deliberate tactic so that even those trying to block them out would find the same reminders of inevitable defeat returning again and again. It was an effort not to overwhelm with variety, but to grind down belief through constant repetition. Perhaps the most elaborate maneuver came at sea. For weeks, American and Allied naval units staged visible exercises just off Kuwait's coast. Amphibious ships with thousands of Marines remained conspicuous offshore, while false radio chatter and controlled signals hinted that a major assault from the water was being prepared. Saddam's generals took the bait. They diverted some of their most capable units to guard the coastline, convinced that an amphibious landing was imminent. In reality, the decisive armored thrust that collapsed Iraqi lines came far inland, through an area intentionally left thinner in defense. When the deception became clear, the psychological effect compounded the damage. Soldiers who had dug in against the supposed landing realized their defensive system had been manipulated from the outset, leaving them stranded where no attack ever came. The air war itself also doubled as a psychological tool. Iraqi units lived under the constant presence of coalition aircraft circling above. Bombs fell unpredictably at all times of day and night, denying rest and ensuring continual strain. Even when not under direct attack, soldiers knew an unseen threat passed overhead. The random rhythm of air strikes, combined with the knowledge that coalition pilots seemed able to reach anywhere, at any time, gradually eroded the ability of troops to think clearly or hold formation. Soldiers later admitted to being too fatigued and anxious to respond effectively when the order to fight finally did come. When the ground offensive began, the results of these weeks of pressure surfaced immediately. Coalition troops advancing across the desert often found dugouts abandoned, armored vehicles deserted with engines still intact, and troops emerging with hands raised before a shot was fired. Surrender came not in isolated incidents, but in mass. Entire companies and battalions approached coalition lines seeking captivity rather than combat. Historically, sustained, bloody assaults were often required to break entrenched defenses. In 1991, preparatory psychological operations had already hollowed many positions long before tanks appeared on the horizon. The speed of collapse was striking. In some sectors, units surrendered en masse within hours of the first probes of the ground campaign. Coalition reports described scenes where streams of prisoners marched back across the desert, rifles thrown aside, their own rations carried in as they gave themselves up. Conscripts had little loyalty to the regime, and even regulars saw little point in clinging to positions they believed were doomed. Officers who might once have rallied resistance struggled to persuade men who had been hearing for weeks that surrender was their only way out. The physical battle had been coupled with a battle of perception, and by the time armored columns arrived, the mental fight had already been lost. Planners had intended this outcome. Psychological operations were never an afterthought. They were embedded into coalition doctrine from the start. By undermining morale before the ground campaign opened, they shortened the fighting and reduced the risk of high coalition casualties. The strategy leaned on consistency. From leaflets to broadcasts, from air pressure to deception plans, the same message echoed again and again, that the war was unwinnable and the safest course was surrender. The result was that many of Iraq's defenses did not collapse under direct assault, but simply dissolved once tested. The scale of surrender that followed shocked outside observers. Post-war accounts confirmed mass capitulations across the theater, numbering in the hundreds of thousands according to official reporting. It was one of the largest instances of military capitulation since the Second World War, and it stood out not only for its magnitude, but for how little fighting was required to produce it. While the coalition's overwhelming firepower had created the material conditions for collapse, it was psychological warfare that translated those conditions into actual mass defections from the battlefield. This legacy continues to shape modern doctrine. Today, leaflets and radio still exist as tools of psychological operations, but they have been joined by digital communication, targeted text messages, online propaganda, and social media manipulation. The medium has evolved, but the logic remains the same. Identify vulnerabilities in enemy morale, widen doubt, and create the perception that survival lies in abandoning the fight. In a world where information moves faster than any aircraft, the Gulf War's lessons reverberate in new settings, showing that soldiers and populations alike can be swayed through persuasion and doubt as much as through destruction. Seen in hindsight, the coalition demonstrated that words, signals, and convincingly staged deceptions could be as destructive to cohesion as bombs and artillery. The battle for morale ran parallel to the battle for territory, and in Iraq's case, it proved decisive. Modern conflicts still echo this experience, drawing upon the same principle. Victory often begins in the mind. The collapse of Iraqi will set the conditions for what followed. Once the coalition finally moved forward, its forces faced opponents already drained of belief in their cause. That reality would determine the tempo and character of the short but decisive ground campaign, now remembered as the 100-hour war. The 100-hour ground war. By late February 1991, coalition commanders gave the order to move. After 6 weeks of bombardment from the air, the long-awaited ground assault finally began. What followed was a campaign that would confound nearly every prediction: the 100-hour ground war. In just 4 days, 500,000 Iraqi troops, many fortified in trench lines and armored positions across Kuwait, collapsed before a mechanized thrust that advanced faster and with fewer casualties than almost any analyst had imagined possible. To understand why, it is necessary to recall what had already unfolded. In the 6 weeks before the offensive, coalition aircraft delivered more than 23,000 strike sorties against Iraqi ground forces. Supply depots, refueling stations, communication nodes, and artillery emplacements were systematically dismantled. When the ground assault began, Iraqi units were already starved of fuel, low on ammunition, and cut off from coordinated command. What remained on the battlefield was one of the largest armies in the Middle East, and yet it was an army already fractured, unable to operate as a single force. Coalition planners designed their attack to exploit this weakness. Rather than hammering directly into the thickest defenses along the Kuwaiti border, they executed a vast left hook. Heavy armored divisions swung wide into the desert of southern Iraq before pivoting to descend behind Iraqi units dug into trench lines. These defensive positions, laced with minefields, barbed wire, and artillery, were prepared for frontal combat, not envelopment. Within hours, many Iraqi troops realized their flanks had been cut off and that retreat lines toward Basra were narrowing. Elaborate preparations meant to delay a sustained assault were suddenly irrelevant against a foe that bypassed them entirely. Close air support played a crucial role in enabling this momentum. During the 100 hours, coalition aircraft, including both Air Force and Marine units, flew more than 1,000 sorties in direct support of advancing forces. Hundreds of missions per day targeted Iraqi armor, artillery, and defensive emplacements immediately ahead of coalition columns. Strikes that once required days of preparation could now be ordered and executed in near real time, clearing the path for tanks and infantry to advance without pause. For soldiers on the ground, this combination of overwhelming air cover and coordinated armor produced a tempo unlike anything expected in a conventional desert war. Still, the skies below 10,000 feet remained a dangerous environment. Despite the collapse of Iraq's integrated air defense system at higher altitudes, low-level skies were thick with anti-aircraft artillery and infrared-guided missiles. Coalition records show that over 80% of aircraft damaged or destroyed by enemy fire during the war were hit in this low-altitude zone. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed for close air support, repeatedly absorbed significant fire during these missions. Its heavy armor and redundant control systems often allowed it to return home, patchwork of holes across its fuselage, but still intact. These sorties were costly and risky, yet they gave frontline troops a buffer by striking tanks hidden in revetments, artillery positions, or vehicles attempting to regroup in the open desert. On the ground, coalition soldiers cut through defensive lines that Iraqi forces had labored over for months. Trenches and berms, modeled on earlier wars of attrition, offered some resistance but little staying power. Without reliable artillery or close air defense, Iraqi infantry fired only briefly before surrendering. The Republican Guard, Iraq's most capable formation, resisted longer, yet even these units dissolved under coordinated attack from American, British, and French armored divisions, with helicopter gunships in support. Apache helicopters prowled ahead of tank columns, knocking out vehicles before ground contact, while mechanized infantry quickly secured surrendering troops and abandoned sites. Ironically, the hardest challenge for coalition commanders was not destroying Iraqi units, but maintaining discipline within their own complex force structure. With dozens of nations involved, thousands of vehicles clustered across vast desert terrain, and the urgency of rapid advances, avoiding friendly fire, became an ever-present concern. Ground vehicles bore large inverted V symbols in dark paint to distinguish them. While this proved effective in close quarters, it was less helpful for pilots attempting to discern friend from foe during low-level engagements. Fratricide occurred, and while incidents were relatively small in number compared to the scale of the war, they underscored the risks of coordinating close air support in congested environments. Roughly 1 in 10 coalition deaths during Desert Storm came from these tragic mistakes. Despite those sobering reminders, losses for coalition ground forces remained far below pre-war expectations. Military planners had braced for thousands of casualties per week if house-to-house fighting or prolonged trench assaults took place. Instead, coalition losses were low, while Iraqi casualties and captured personnel numbered in the tens of thousands. The discrepancy was not simply a matter of superior weapons. It reflected how thoroughly the air and electronic campaigns had hollowed Iraq's army before the first armored divisions rolled forward. The dramatic collapse was nowhere more evident than on the road north to Basra, where retreating Iraqi vehicles were struck from above. What became known as the Highway of Death reflected a final attempt at withdrawal turned into a column of wreckage stretching for miles. Images of charred tanks, trucks, and abandoned equipment captured the scale of Iraq's defeat more vividly than any map. While the destruction was heavily publicized in Western media, it also raised early debates about proportionality and the nature of pursuing a routed opponent under continuous air attack. For coalition troops on the ground, the brevity of the war defied expectation. Soldiers had been told to anticipate weeks of grueling combat, perhaps longer. Instead, many found that once breakthrough was achieved, Iraqi resistance dissolved faster than orders could be relayed. By the end of the fourth day, Iraqi forces were ejected from Kuwait defensive networks that had been in place since August were gone, and the war's political objectives were fulfilled. For Iraq, the speed of their collapse was not just military but psychological, a humiliation broadcast worldwide. For modern analysts, the 100-hour ground war remains a case study in the importance of preparation shaping outcome. Long before tanks advanced, precision bombing, electronic disruption, and psychological operations had eroded Iraqi capacity to resist. What seemed on paper to be a conventional clash of nearly equal numbers was in fact an asymmetrical contest. One side entered intact, but hollow, cut off from supply and coordination. The other arrived with overwhelming integration between air and ground assets, able to maneuver at will. The result was decided before the first firefight in open terrain. Looking back from the vantage point of 2025, the lesson of the short campaign is not only its speed, but also its disproportionality. A massive army, entrenched for months, was broken in less than a week. Coalition losses were limited by the standards of major wars, while Iraqi losses were catastrophic in lives, infrastructure, and equipment. This imbalance became one of the defining examples of how technological and doctrinal shifts could compress what once seemed like protracted wars into operations lasting only days. The outcome, however, raised more questions than it answered. How could such a decisive victory come at relatively low human cost for one side? What did this say about the future of coalition campaigns in the modern era? And beyond the battlefield, what price was actually paid to achieve such speed and success? Those questions came into sharper focus as analysts began to examine the broader costs of the war, not in blood, but in treasure. The true cost in 2025 dollars. What did this lightning-fast campaign actually cost once the figures are carried forward into today's terms? The scale of the deployment gives an impression of limitless expense. Hundreds of thousands of troops transporting half a world away, aircraft flying day and night, and a constant stream of fuel, munitions, and supplies sustaining the advance. But when examined in adjusted numbers, Desert Storm looks very different from the overwhelming burden that many assumed at the time. Contemporary estimates place the war's cost at roughly $60 billion. That figure, tallied in the early 1990s, shaped much of the conversation about whether the conflict was worth the price. To modern ears, given decades of intervening inflation, the raw number understates its weight. Carried forward into 2025 dollars, economists point out that those wartime appropriations translate into a far larger multiple, often characterized in the hundreds of billions, depending on the index used. The larger point is clear. What seemed vast in 1991 appears even more substantial when rescaled, underscoring that Desert Storm was never a cheap war in absolute terms. Yet context changes perceptions. The campaigns that followed September 11th accumulated not in the tens or even hundreds of billions, but in the trillions. Those protracted operations in Afghanistan and Iraq dragged on for years, bringing costs for reconstruction, counterinsurgency, and veteran care that multiplied far beyond the initial appropriations. Against that backdrop, Desert Storm, compressed into little more than a month of combat and a short post-conflict presence, appears financially contained. Its brevity prevented the cascade of expenses that define long occupations, repeated troop surges, long-term logistics tails, and decades of medical and pension obligations. Just as important was the way in which the costs were distributed. More than 30 nations contributed to the coalition. These contributions were not restricted to soldiers and equipment. They included substantial financial commitments. Gulf states shouldered a significant portion of the bill, recognizing that the liberation of Kuwait was as much about their survival as it was about international order. Japan and other allies, unable to commit combat troops under their own laws, contributed funds and logistics. The result was a model where one nation, even the largest contributor, never bore the full financial strain. For Washington, this arrangement significantly reduced the real draw on its own treasury. The war's gross costs can be quoted in large sums, but the US outlay was trimmed substantially by this burden sharing. This model of coalition support altered how the war was experienced at home. American citizens heard about tens of billions being spent, but few recognized that external funding had offset much of that figure. In practice, the actual US contribution was substantially lower than the headline numbers suggested. Later interventions would not replicate this financing. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States shouldered overwhelming financial responsibility with only marginal Allied assistance. In retrospect, this difference explains why Desert Storm still appears comparatively light in fiscal memory, even when adjusted upward into today's values. Operational choices also influenced the outlay. Precision-guided munitions carried high sticker prices compared to older unguided bombs, but their efficiency shortened the war. Instead of returning again and again to collapse a single bridge or bunker, one sortie could achieve the same effect. The upfront expense saved both time and broader resource costs, trading quantity for accuracy. Similarly, Cold War preparations had left the United States with a global logistics network already in place. Pre-positioned equipment, fleets of cargo aircraft, and naval lift capacity meant that Desert Storm did not require inventing a new supply system from scratch. That legacy infrastructure allowed for an enormous deployment in record time without the massive one-off procurement surges that prolong costs in other conflicts. Another factor was what the coalition chose not to do. After Kuwait's liberation, forces did not remain as a long-term occupation authority. Reconstruction requirements were left minimal. No attempt was made to rebuild Iraq as a functioning state under coalition management. This decision sharply reduced costs after the fighting. The approach stood in stark contrast to the nation-building ventures of later decades, which demanded continual infusions of money, not merely for armies, but for infrastructure, governance, and stabilization projects. Desert Storm's narrowly defined mission insulated its participants from those expenses. None of this should suggest that the war was inexpensive in a literal sense. Appropriations that measure in the hundreds of billions by today's standards are never minor. But seen in comparison to the later wars of the early 2000s, the Gulf War falls into a category few modern campaigns occupy. A rapid, coalition-backed intervention that achieved its political and military goals at a fraction of the long-term financial cost seen in protracted occupations. Policymakers at the time could highlight that not only had Kuwait been liberated and Iraq's forces shattered, but the broader financial impact on the US Treasury had been kept within bounds by time limits and allied contributions. Economic analysts often point to this paradox. Desert Storm was at once staggeringly expensive when judged by its own moment, but relatively economical when set against the decades of spending that came afterward. Without a protracted deployment, without large-scale reconstruction, and with much of the bill offset by partners, the war remains one of the rare cases where a swift, decisive campaign achieved strategic aims without ballooning into endless commitments. This outcome carries a broader lesson. The containment of costs was not an accident of history, but the result of choices, clear objectives, reliance on an unusually wide coalition, and a refusal to expand mission scope beyond the liberation of Kuwait. Where later wars sprawled into open-ended commitments and multi-generational bills, Desert Storm demonstrated that aligning political aims tightly with military action could restrain the burden in ways not often repeated since. Even adjusted into 2025 dollars, the war's financial profile still stands out. It was vast in absolute numbers, strikingly modest in comparison to the conflicts that followed, and unique in how it was shared among nations. In military history, it is remembered for stealth and precision. In economic history, it endures as one of the lowest-cost examples of a rapid multinational campaign. That dual character, expensive yet efficient, massive yet temporary, defines the Gulf War's distinct place on the balance sheet of modern warfare. How those choices reverberated into the decades since, and how the methods of 1991 shaped the character of conflicts that followed, is the next question to consider. From Desert Storm to modern conflicts. From Desert Storm onward, every major conflict has carried traces of its methods. What first appeared in 1991 as an imbalance between Iraq's aging arsenal and the coalition's modern force proved instead to be a demonstration of principles that endured. Precision strikes, stealth as a form of access, information control, and psychological pressure became part of the durable blueprint for high-technology warfare. They did not stand alone, but combined with post-Cold War geopolitics and the spread of digital technologies, they shaped the way wars have been fought since. The arrival of the smart bomb in 1991 was perhaps the most immediate lesson. Although only a small share of strikes used guided munitions, their effectiveness made them the emblem of the campaign. After that demonstration, no military could afford to ignore the power of precision. Today, guided missiles, artillery shells, and bombs dominate many Western arsenals. In Ukraine, small, portable GPS-steered munitions have proven decisive in bridging the gap between industrial firepower and limited stockpiles. The expectation is fixed. Weapons should land within meters of their target, and militaries train on the assumption that accuracy is the baseline rather than the exception. What seemed novel during the Gulf War has reached across domains, air, sea, and land, and been integrated with real-time adjustments through onboard processors and AI-enhanced guidance. Stealth also revealed its staying power. The F-117's ability to operate over Baghdad highlighted how radar and missile defenses could be bypassed not by brute force, but by avoiding detection. This shifted global investments. NATO leaned into stealth platforms like the F-35, while rivals such as Russia and China poured resources into radar arrays and long-range missiles meant to detect and challenge them. Even states unable to field stealth aircraft learned the lesson, strengthening their integrated air defense networks to deny access to skies rather than hope to contest them later. The logic that emerged from Desert Storm still guides strategic competition. The ability to enter defended airspace safely determines who can deliver decisive effects. Air dominance remains inseparable from these debates. The campaign of 1991 proved how control of the skies created the conditions for everything else. Coalition aircraft flew unopposed once Iraqi air defenses were neutralized, and that superiority enabled the ground war to unfold in days instead of months. By contrast, conflicts where no side has achieved clear air control, most visibly in Ukraine, have been slower, bloodier, and shaped by grinding artillery duels. In the Pacific, calculations of who holds the skies in the first phase of a conflict occupy center stage. That fixation traces in part to Desert Storm. Once the skies are secure, ground forces deprived of cover face disintegration. Another enduring lesson came from the war's use of satellites and secure communications. For the first time, space ceased to be a support function and became central to combat. Commanders directed forces with clarity across hundreds of miles, guided by GPS coordinates and satellite relays. Armies realized that fighting without space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance would leave them effectively blind. In today's conflicts, streams of satellite imagery track enemy unit movements within hours. Communication satellites keep forces linked under strain, and space is treated as contested ground. By 2025, militaries consider space-based ISR as vital as any armored formation, an inheritance rooted in Desert Storm. That war also showed the impact of information warfare in its earliest form. Iraqi radar and communications networks were suppressed until units became ineffective long before tanks broke through. What began with jamming and anti-radiation missiles has since become integrated cyber campaigns. Modern warfare now includes GPS spoofing to mislead navigation, cyber intrusions that disable infrastructure, and electronic interference that blinds drones. NATO doctrines expect electronic and cyber attacks to precede major operations, while Russia has employed jamming extensively in Ukraine. The enduring thread reaches back to 1991. Destroy or distort information flows, and the enemy cannot respond effectively. Psychological warfare likewise proved durable. The surrender of Iraqi soldiers en masse after weeks of leaflets, broadcasts, and staged deceptions demonstrated that morale could collapse even when numbers and weapons promised resilience. In 1991, paper leaflets and radio broadcasts shaped perceptions. By 2025, digital platforms and mobile phones carry that role. Information operations now strike not only soldiers, but populations, with social media campaigns meant to weaken trust in leadership and undercut civilian resolve. The principle remains unchanged. Wars are not fought only on physical terrain, but in the realm of confidence and fear. If Desert Storm's hallmark was speed and overwhelming technological disparity, its broader influence lay in the model it created. It was war designed for rapid dominance, not attrition. Strike networks, collapse command systems, and undermine morale, then exploit the paralysis with fast-moving ground units. That model survived in NATO training, evident in exercises built around disabling command and control within the opening days. The idea is that by paralyzing leadership early, the campaign itself can be shortened. This shock model remains central to Western doctrine, even as opponents work to deny its execution. Rivals who once dismissed the Gulf War as a unique mismatch have since internalized its implications. Russia invested in GPS jamming, integrated air defense, and cruise missile development, all aimed at countering Western precision. China built anti-access strategies combining long-range missiles, naval platforms, and electronic denial, designed to keep US stealth fighters and bombers at distance. Their doctrines are responses to 1991, acknowledgements that the structure of combat introduced then continues to shape the arena. By 2025, these principles still define many aspects of military planning. Drones swarm across fronts as extensions of precision fires. Integrated satellite networks provide situational awareness in real time. Electronic disruption marks the start of almost every engagement, just as wild weasels once opened air corridors. Guided munitions have become the default, not the exception, and space-based assets underpin movement as surely as fuel or ammunition. Desert Storm's lessons do not explain everything. The geopolitics of the post-Cold War world, advances in technology, and the spread of asymmetric methods all added layers, but they remain a powerful spine on which modern conflict rests. The question, however, is how secure that model remains. If Desert Storm taught militaries to strike fast and blind the enemy, what becomes of those doctrines in a world where satellites can be targeted, networks hacked, or precision weapons intercepted by advanced defenses. The very strategies born in 1991 now face their own vulnerabilities. Future wars may test whether the blueprint of Desert Storm can still deliver decisive advantage when adversaries know the pattern and prepare to contest it directly. 3 decades later, the Gulf War stands as more than an episode of overwhelming strength. It was a turning point that showed how technology, information, and psychology could combine into a rapid form of warfare. Its legacy remains visible in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in planning across the Pacific. To understand modern conflicts is to recognize how often they unfold in the shadow of 1991, and how those choices still frame the struggles of today. The Gulf War was not simply a clash in the desert. It marked the point where modern warfare stepped into the information age. Stealth aircraft, GPS guidance, precision munitions, and space-based surveillance revealed how technology could redefine the battlefield. What was demonstrated in just 43 days became a framework still visible in 2025. Desert Storm didn't just win a war, it rewired how states fight, and those currents still shape doctrine, budgets, and tactics today. If this analysis helped you see why modern wars unfold the way they do, remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives.